There is a peculiar kind of suffering that arises not from malice, but from too much love. It belongs to those who, since childhood, learned to sense the emotional weather of others as if it were their own skin. They are the empaths who do not know how to say enough. Their tragedy is not in their capacity to feel, but in their inability to differentiate between the pain that is theirs and the pain that is borrowed from the world. It is as though the boundaries of their soul were drawn in water, beautiful, reflective, but easily disturbed by every ripple of human despair. When I speak of empathy, I do not mean the sentimental kind, the surface compassion that wears the costume of virtue. I speak of something much older, something archetypal. The ancient instinct of the healer, the one who once sat by the wounded hunter, listening to the howl of his spirit beneath the flesh. In the empath, that archetype has awakened again, but without initiation, without protection, without the sacred circle that teaches the healer to balance light with shadow. Thus the empath becomes an open wound in human form, a vessel through which the suffering of the collective unconscious flows unfiltered. The origin of this pattern lies in childhood, that fragile alchemy between love and fear. Imagine a child who grows up in a house where emotions thunder like gods in conflict. The mother weeps quietly in the kitchen. The father carries storms behind his silence, and the air is thick with unnamed anxieties. The child, still luminous, still porous to the invisible, absorbs these moods as if they were messages from heaven. To survive, the child learns to read the smallest tremor in the atmosphere, the tightening of a jaw, the sudden stillness before an argument. The child's body becomes the instrument of divination, the soul, a seismograph of unspoken pain. It is not empathy that is born here, but vigilance disguised as love. Over time, this vigilance becomes identity. The child no longer knows who they are apart from their sensitivity to others. They begin to believe that to exist safely, they must anticipate the needs of everyone around them. Every sigh becomes a commandment, every frown a wound that must be healed. To be loved becomes synonymous with being useful, being attuned, being the balm for another's discomfort. Thus, the empathic soul enters the world not as a whole being, but as a caretaker of the emotional wounds of others, a silent savior who forgets their own name. When I speak to you now, I do not speak to your intellect alone. I speak to that silent place within you that has watched others bleed and whispered, "Let me help." You have mistaken your compassion for purpose, your exhaustion for devotion, and yet beneath this noble suffering lies a hidden arrogance, the secret belief that you can absorb and transmute the darkness of others by your mere presence. But this is not humility. It is a form of unconscious inflation, the shadow side of empathy. It is the archetype of the wounded Savior, the Christ without resurrection. The psyche does not reward such imbalance. What begins as empathy often decays into resentment, fatigue, and quiet despair. The empath becomes addicted to the drama of healing others, because without it, they do not know who they are. They find partners who are broken, friends who are chaotic, communities that drain them, for the unconscious seeks not peace, but repetition, the endless attempt to heal the original wound by reenacting it. Thus, the empath spends a lifetime replaying the same sacred tragedy, giving too much, receiving too little, mistaking sacrifice for love. The unconscious is a mirror, not a moralist. It will show you the pattern until you learn to see it, not as destiny, but as invitation. When the empath begins to awaken, there comes a moment quiet, terrifying when they realize that compassion can also be a defense. It can protect one from the unbearable truth that not all pain can be healed, and not every soul wants to be saved. To accept this is to confront the shadow of the healer, the rage, the grief, the helplessness buried beneath all that kindness. For the empath who cannot say enough, the word itself becomes a threshold between life and death, the death of illusion and the birth of true selfhood. There is an image that comes to me often when I speak of this. In a dream, one stands before a vast lake. The surface is so still it reflects the stars, and one's own face appears faintly, as if suspended between heaven and water. Then suddenly, figures emerge from the depths, pale hands reaching upward, pleading for help. The empath's first instinct is to dive in, to rescue, to breathe. For those who cannot breathe, but as they descend, they realize the lake has no bottom. The deeper they go, the more hands appear, the more faces cry out, until they can no longer distinguish who they are saving and who is drowning them. That moment of panic, when one's lungs burn and the water presses against the ribs, that is the soul's demand for boundary. To rise back to the surface is to reclaim one's own life. You see, the capacity to feel deeply is not the same as the capacity to live wisely. Empathy must evolve into discernment. Just as compassion must mature into consciousness, without this transformation, the empath remains a slave to the emotions of others, forever reacting, forever rescuing. And yet the unconscious does not abandon such souls. It calls to them through dreams, through exhaustion, through the mysterious illnesses that come when one has given too much. The body becomes the messenger of the soul, whispering, enough. And when I worked with patients who carried this pattern, I often observed how the unconscious tried to restore balance through symbolic rebellion. The dream would show them locking doors, drawing curtains, walking alone through forests. In waking life, they would feel guilt for wanting solitude, for not answering every cry for help. But these were not selfish impulses. They were the psyche's attempt to create sacred space, to allow the self to breathe. The empath must learn that solitude is not abandonment, it is communion with the inner world. For without that communion, they are cut off from the source of true compassion, the one that arises not from guilt, but from wholeness You may ask, then, how one learns to say enough without closing the heart. The answer is paradoxical. As all truths of the soul are, the empaths must first allow themselves to feel the full weight of their fatigue, their bitterness, their disappointment in humanity. They must let the tears that were never for themselves finally fall. This descent into honest emotion is not regression, it is initiation. For only by acknowledging one's own pain can one distinguish between the authentic call to help and the compulsive need to heal others in order to avoid oneself. There is a subtle tyranny in excessive goodness. The empath who cannot say no often does so not from love, but from fear, the fear of being rejected, of being seen as cold, of being left alone with their own emptiness. And yet it is precisely through that aloneness that the soul matures to be able to say, I cannot hold this for you, is to honor the divine law of individuality. Even God, in the old myths, withdrew after creation, allowing his creatures to struggle and grow. The empath, too, must learn divine detachment, the wisdom to witness suffering without dissolving into it. This, then, is the first movement of the empath's awakening, the realization that love without boundary is not virtue, but self-erasure. The second movement follows naturally as the soul begins to reclaim the fragments it has scattered across the faces of others. For every person you have tried to save contains a reflection of the self you abandoned. To withdraw your light from them is not cruelty. It is the sacred act of gathering your scattered being back into wholeness. The path from compulsive empathy to conscious compassion is not a straight ascent toward light. It is a spiral descent into the underworld of one's own motives. Every empath who learns to say enough must first descend into the ancient archetype that governs their suffering, the wounded healer. This figure has appeared in every age and mythology, from Chiron to Christ, from the shamans who bled with the sick to the mystics who bore invisible stigmata. The essence of this archetype is paradox. It is through one's own wound that one gains the capacity to heal. And yet, it is precisely this wound that, if left unconscious, becomes a curse that devours both healer and healed. You, who have spent your life feeling the pain of others, must understand that your empathy is not merely psychological, it is mythic. It is the unconscious expression of the divine instinct to restore what is broken in the cosmos. But when the ego identifies with this divine impulse, it becomes inflated. It tries to play God in the lives of others. You do not rescue because you are whole. You rescue because you are still unconsciously trying to redeem the parent who could not love you fully, the sibling who was lost to addiction, the partner who mirrored your own disowned need. You are not drawn to pain by accident. The psyche magnetizes you toward the unfinished business of the soul. In analysis, I often saw how the empaths unconsciously reenacted the same myth over and over. They would find themselves drawn to those who could not love them back, compelled by an almost sacred fascination with brokenness. They believed they saw the light within the darkness, but in truth, they were seeking their own buried light reflected in the other's suffering. This is the secret of projection. You do not see the other as they are, but as a mirror of what you have disowned in yourself. The narcissist who consumes your empathy is not simply a predator, they are an emissary of your shadow, carrying the very qualities you have exiled: selfishness, assertiveness, power. Until you reclaim those qualities, you will continue to dance this fatal waltz of giver and taker, savior and sinner. The unconscious has no interest in comfort. Its aim is wholeness, and wholeness demands confrontation. Thus, when you begin to awaken, you may find that life brings you into conflict with precisely those people who expose your weakness, those who demand that you set limits, those who will not be saved by your love. The soul arranges these encounters as mirrors of initiation. The empath who refuses to learn boundary will attract situations that force it upon them: betrayal, exhaustion, illness. These are not punishments, they are the language of the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche, calling you to integrate what has been split. There is a beautiful cruelty in this process. The very sensitivity that once defined your identity becomes unbearable. You begin to resent the same compassion that once made you proud. The heart, once open like a wound, now aches to close. But closure, too, can be sacred. If it is born from awareness, the empath must learn the holy art of containment, to hold love within, to let it mature, to let it ferment into wisdom. For love that flows endlessly outward becomes diluted. Love that circulates inward transforms into gold. This is the alchemy of the wounded healer, to transmute empathy into understanding and understanding into individuation. In alchemy, every transformation begins with nigredo, the blackening, the stage of dissolution, where the old identity dies and the soul sits in darkness. For the empath, this is the moment of saying no for the first time and feeling the unbearable guilt that follows. The ego trembles, for it has long equated refusal with cruelty. But in that guilt lies the seed of liberation, for it is the beginning of differentiation. The soul begins to discern between compassion that nourishes and compassion that destroys. Do not rush through this darkness. Sit with it. Feel the phantom pain of all the people you can no longer save. Mourn the version of yourself who believed love meant exhaustion. For in that mourning, you will hear the faintest whisper, the voice of the self saying, now you can begin to love truthfully. True empathy does not drown with the drowning. It extends a hand from solid ground. It does not silence its own voice to hear another's. It listens with both heart and boundary. This balance is not taught by the intellect, but by the suffering of experience. In the dreams of empaths, I have often seen a recurring image, a room full of mirrors, each reflecting a different face. Some are crying, some angry, some pleading. The dreamer runs from mirror to mirror, trying to comfort each reflection, until at last they collapse in exhaustion. When they look up, they notice one mirror left untouched, covered with dust. When they wipe it clean, they see not another's face, but their own, tired, tender, and terribly human. That is the moment of awakening, the realization that the first soul in need of healing has always been the one behind the eyes. When the empath finally turns toward their own reflection, they discover a new kind of silence, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of presence. They no longer rush to fill every void with kindness, for they have learned that emptiness is not always a wound. Sometimes it is the womb of becoming. The capacity to be with one's own emptiness is the mark of true maturity. It is what allows love to be given freely without the secret agenda of being needed in return. And yet, even as one ascends from this realization, the archetypal drama continues. The healer within must face its shadow counterpart, the martyr. The martyr whispers, "If I stop giving, I will lose my worth." It feeds on guilt and disguises self-neglect as virtue. The empath who confuses exhaustion with devotion still serves this inner tyrant. To dethrone it, one must expose the lie at its heart, that love must cost you everything to be real. The truth is, otherwise, love that destroys the self cannot redeem the other. Only love that includes the self can transform the world. In this revelation, the empath begins to experience a strange reversal. They who once felt responsible for everyone else now begin to feel responsible for themselves. They who once apologized for existing now speak with quiet authority. This newfound firmness is not hardness, it is integrity. It is the integration of shadow, the recognition that one's right to exist does not depend on constant giving. When the empath says enough, they are not rejecting love, they are invoking it in its highest form, love that honors the soul's limits as sacred. Let us pause here, for this is a moment of initiation. The old self, built upon the scaffolding of endless caretaking, crumbles. The new self emerges, uncertain yet radiant, learning that to love consciously is to love with the awareness of one's own boundary. This, I tell you, is the threshold of individuation. The empath who crosses it becomes not less compassionate, but more precise in their compassion. They begin to see that some suffering must be allowed to complete its own cycle, that some souls require not rescue but witness. At this stage, the dreams shift again. The lake that once drowned you now becomes a mirror. The hands that once pulled you down now wave farewell. You stand upon the shore, breathing for the first time without guilt. The sunlight hurts your eyes because you have lived too long beneath the surface. And then, from somewhere deep within, you hear the soul whisper, "This is what it means to love in truth, to know when to stay and when to walk away." There is a paradox at the heart of love, and it is one that few dare to touch. It is the truth that genuine compassion must include distance, that one cannot hold another's pain without first having stood apart from it. This is not indifference, but divine detachment, the capacity to witness suffering without drowning in it. to stand in the burning house and feel the heat without losing oneself to the flames. The empath who learns to say enough is not betraying love, but entering its higher octave. The octave where love ceases to be a compulsion and becomes a conscious act of creation. The universe itself teaches this law. Creation was born not through endless fusion, but through separation. The mythic God, after shaping the world, withdrew so that life could evolve freely. Without that withdrawal, there would be no individuality, no growth, no soul. In the same way, the empath must learn to withdraw their psychic presence from others so that both may breathe. The soul needs space to unfold. Love that suffocates, no matter how pure its intention, arrests the development of the other. The divine detachment of which I speak is thus an imitation of the cosmic principle, the love that creates by stepping back. And yet, to the empath's heart, this withdrawal feels like abandonment. For their nervous system, conditioned since childhood to merge, interprète séparation as danger, the inner child still remembers the silence of neglect, the absence of warmth, the cold echo of an unresponsive world. So when you, dear empath, begin to draw boundaries, the ghost of that child rises, trembling, whispering, "They will leave you." This is the emotional inheritance that must be faced before one can ever truly love as an adult. For until the child within you learns that distance is not death, you will continue to confuse merging with safety and depletion with devotion. In dream language, this process often appears as the image of the mother's breast withdrawing just as the child reaches for it. The dreamer wakes with anguish, feeling the ache of both hunger and betrayal. But if the dream is followed over time, it transforms. The child learns to stand, to reach beyond the mother, to discover food elsewhere, fruit, water, sun. The archetype of nourishment moves from dependency to autonomy. This is the journey from emotional fusion to spiritual individuation. To say enough is to allow that archetype to evolve. The ego resists this fiercely. It tells you that to detach is to harden, to betray the mission of your soul, but the self, that inner, eternal nucleus of being, whispers another message, that you were never meant to be everyone's healer. Your sensitivity is a sacred instrument, not a leash. If you let every sorrow play through you, the strings will snap. Only when you learn to choose what melodies you will allow can your empathy become art rather than chaos. When the empath first practices detachment, they feel guilt, as though they are committing a sin against their own nature. They imagine themselves becoming cold, distant, unfeeling. But what emerges instead is clarity. The fog of projection lifts. They begin to see people not as victims to be saved, but as souls walking their own labyrinth. The eyes that once wept with pity now see with understanding. The heart that once bled now radiates a steady warmth. This is not the end of feeling, but the birth of consciousness within feeling, what I call seeing with the heart. One must remember that empathy without wisdom can become tyranny. When you interfere with another's necessary suffering, you rob them of their initiation. Every soul must face its own shadow. No one can do that work for them. The empath's inability to say enough is often rooted in a secret superiority, the belief that they know better than the unconscious process unfolding in another. To withdraw is to surrender that illusion of control and to trust the greater intelligence of life. Detachment, then, is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of reverence. This reverence transforms the very nature of the empath's presence. Where once they absorbed pain, now they reflect it. Like a mountain lake, they become still enough for others to see their own reflection within them. This is the final metamorphosis of empathy, from identification to illumination. You no longer carry the world's sorrow. You hold the mirror in which it can recognize itself. And in that reflection, healing happens naturally, without force, without sacrifice. The ancient mystics understood this. They spoke of the compassionate gaze, the look that neither condemns nor condones, but simply sees. Such seeing itself becomes medicine. The empath who masters this gaze steps out of the polarity of victim and rescuer. They no longer oscillate between exhaustion and ecstasy. They walk instead in the still rhythm of being, allowing love to flow through them like light through glass, unresisted yet ungrasped. But to arrive here, one must endure the crucible of solitude. After years of defining oneself through others, the empath who withdraws faces a vast inner silence. It feels at first like exile. You will wonder who you are when no one needs you. You will touch the edges of despair, because the identity built on usefulness begins to crumble. This dark night is sacred. It is the nigredo of individuation, once again, but now at a higher turn of the spiral. Out of this emptiness emerges the realization that you exist even when you are not saving anyone, that your being has value independent of its service, that the mere act of presence, without effort, is already a form of grace. From this emptiness, dreams begin to change once more. You may find yourself walking in landscapes that feel both vast and familiar, deserts, oceans, temples. There is no one to help, no one to heal, only the rhythm of your own breath and the distant hum of the stars. And then, perhaps, a subtle warmth arises within your chest, as if something long dormant has awakened. This is not the old compassion that rushed to give. It is the quiet fire of essence, the joy of simply being alive. You begin to feel the world not as weight, but as music. You do not absorb it, you resonate with it. At this stage, empathy becomes prayer. Every act, every glance, every silence carries awareness. You listen to others not to fix them, but to allow truth to emerge between you. You no longer fear saying enough. because you understand that endings are not rejections but thresholds. The relationships that survive your boundaries are those aligned with your essence. The ones that fall away were bound only by need. In this way, the empath becomes the alchemist of relationship, transforming codependence into communion. The shadow, too, softens in this light. Those you once called toxic, you now see as teachers, catalysts, who revealed your own unhealed patterns. The narcissist who drained you was the mirror of your own unconscious pride. The wounded lover who clung was the echo of your neglected inner child. Through them, you have met yourself, and having met yourself, you can finally forgive them, not from weakness, but from understanding. Forgiveness here is not absolution. It is integration. It is a recognition that all opposites, giver and taker, empath and narcissist, savior and destroyer, are threads in the same tapestry of psyche. This is the moment of rebirth. The empath, who once dissolved into others, now emerges as an individual soul, luminous yet grounded. They are no longer a sponge, but a beacon. Their presence does not absorb darkness. It transforms it by awareness alone. They have learned the art of divine detachment, to love without losing themselves, to give without depletion, to stay without surrendering their center. The word enough has become a mantra of freedom, a seal of sovereignty, and so the spiral turns once more, as all psychic processes do. The empath returns to the world, but now with new eyes. They feel as deeply as ever, but no longer mistake feeling for duty. They see pain, but they also see the intelligence behind it. They help, but only when the soul of the other truly calls, not when the ego demands. Their compassion has matured into wisdom, their sensitivity into strength. They have become what the alchemists called the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, the soul made whole through fire and limit. And in this wholeness, a new paradox unfolds. By knowing when to say enough, the empath finally discovers that love itself has no end. When the empath who could never say enough finally learns the sacred language of limit, a new form of radiance emerges, a light not born from sacrifice but from integration. It is quieter now, less dramatic, more enduring. It no longer blinds nor burns. It does not rush to illuminate everything around it. It simply is. This is the light of consciousness, the inner fire that has passed through darkness and returned transformed. The empath has become what I once called the individuated soul, a vessel through which the divine expresses itself with awareness rather than compulsion. Such a soul is no longer ruled by the emotional currents of the collective. They stand like a lighthouse at the edge of the sea, not to control the waves, not to rescue every ship, but to shine steadily, faithfully, as a point of orientation for those still lost in storm. This is what it means to serve the world without losing the self. It is the fulfillment of the healer's archetype, to heal not by absorbing pain, but by embodying wholeness. Yet let us not idealize this state. It is not a permanent rapture, not a final escape from suffering. To live consciously is to remain in dialogue with one's own shadow, to continually meet the forgotten faces within. The difference now is that the empath no longer fears that dialogue. They no longer mistake every tremor of another's pain for a call to action. They have discovered that silence, too, can be an act of compassion, that sometimes the greatest gift one can offer the world is one's own peace. When I look at the modern soul, overstimulated, overconnected, drowning in collective emotion, I see why so many sensitive beings become exhausted. The world, in its noise, demands empathy but fears intimacy. It celebrates emotional openness yet mocks vulnerability. Thus, the empath becomes both scapegoat and saint, absorbing what society refuses to feel. But in truth, the world does not need more suffering absorbers. It needs conscious witnesses. The future of empathy lies not in feeling more, but in feeling with awareness, in transforming compassion from a reflex into a revelation. This is the spiritual responsibility of the awakened empath, to embody sensitivity as intelligence, to offer presence rather than rescue. Such souls become living mirrors of the collective unconscious. Through them, the deeper layers of humanity learn to see themselves. When an empath says enough with clarity and love, they are not rejecting the world, they are teaching it. They are showing that boundaries are not barriers, but the architecture of consciousness itself. Without them, there can be no form, no meaning, nor encounter. And perhaps this is the true secret hidden within your suffering, that your lifelong inability to say enough was not a mistake, but an initiation. The soul had to lose itself in others to understand the cost of unbounded love. It had to taste depletion, to crave the nectar of selfhood. Every exhaustion was a ritual of descent, every heartbreak a passage through the underworld. And now, having risen, you carry the wisdom of both realms, the tenderness of empathy and the clarity of boundary. You are no longer merely human, you are archetypal. You carry within you the story of the healer's redemption. In this light, the wounds of the past no longer feel like curses. They become symbols, emblems of initiation. The parent whose chaos taught you to feel too much, they were the first messenger of your path. The lovers who drained you were the shadows that shaped your discernment. The betrayals that shattered your trust were the hammer blows that forged your sovereignty. What was once personal becomes mythic. What was once pain becomes pattern. You begin to see that the self has always been weaving something vast through your small human life. The empath who knows how to say enough becomes a teacher without words. Their very presence alters the atmosphere of a room. They listen differently. They speak differently. There is a stillness in them that others instinctively trust. though they cannot explain why this stillness is not absence, but fullness, the fullness of one who has touched both chaos and calm and no longer fears either. They have seen that the light and the shadow are not enemies, but lovers in eternal embrace, and they have ceased trying to separate them. There is, however, one last illusion to dissolve the belief that individuation is the end of the journey. It is not the individual who attains wholeness, is called back inevitably into the collective, just as the hero returns from the underworld to share the elixir. The empath must return to life, to community, to relationship, not to lose themselves again, but to illuminate the path for others. The circle must close. The healed healer becomes the guide. This return is subtle. It does not announce itself with grandeur. The empath finds themselves once more in the ordinary, in conversations, in work, in love, but something has shifted. They no longer seek validation through usefulness. They no longer measure their worth by the happiness of others. They love now from freedom, not from fear, and this love, because it is free, has a peculiar power. It liberates all it touches. Those around them begin to feel it, though they cannot name it. They feel seen without being possessed, held without being bound. That is the gift of the awakened empath, to create space in which souls may unfold naturally, without interference. In dreams, this stage often appears as a garden. The empath walks among flowers that once wilted under their overwatering, but now thrive in balanced sunlight. The hands that once trembled with exhaustion now move with gentleness, tending, not saving. The dream ends not with drama, but with peace, a symbol that the inner ecology has been restored. The self has achieved equilibrium. To say enough, in the end, is to enter partnership with life itself. It is to recognize that you are not the source of all healing, but a participant in an infinite dance of giving and receiving. It is to know, as the mystics knew, that the divine moves through boundaries as easily as it does through open doors. Love is not diminished by form, it is refined by it. Without the vessel, there is no wine. Without the skin, no blood. Without the self, no soul. And so the empath who once wept for the world now smiles quietly at its beauty and its madness alike. They understand that every being must find their own way through the labyrinth of existence. They walk beside others, not ahead. They offer their light, but they do not force it. And sometimes, when the darkness grows deep, they withdraw to rest, not out of apathy, but out of faith that the world, too, contains its own intelligence. I have often said that the task of life is to make the unconscious conscious. For the empath who learns to say enough, this task is fulfilled through love itself. What was once blind compassion becomes illuminated awareness. What was once sacrifice becomes service. The unconscious impulse to merge with all things transforms into the conscious realization that one is already united with all things, not through feeling everything, but through being present to everything without resistance. This, my friends, is the final alchemy of the empathic soul, to transform the curse of over feeling into the blessing of understanding. To know the boundary not as a wall, but as a membrane through which life breathes. To walk in the world as both participant and witness, lover and observer, human and divine. To say enough not as rejection, but as affirmation, the affirmation of being, of balance, of sacred selfhood. And in the silence that follows this realization, the world seems to breathe differently. The storms do not cease, but they no longer drown you. The cries of others do not vanish, but they no longer pierce your marrow. You hear them as you understand them, but you also hear the deeper music beneath the music of the whole, the eternal rhythm of the soul's becoming, and in that rhythm you find your rest. For the empath who could never say enough has finally discovered that the word was never a closing door. It was a prayer, the prayer that opened the way back home